So now that we have all our characters displaying on page, we need to add the functionality to be able to click on a character and get more data about them. So the first thing we'll do this time around is we will create the reducer of where we're going to store this new data. So if we open up our index.js of our initial reducer, we want to import character, which is going to be a new combined reducer, and we want to include that in our main piece of state. Now that we have that there, we need to create this new character combined reducer. So we will create a new directory called character, and inside it we will create a file called index.js. This is going to be very similar to the other one. We need to bring in combined reducers again, and we're also going to import another reducer that we're going to create here in a bit called ID, and it's just going to hold the currently selected character's ID. We need to make sure that we're exporting what comes out of combined reducers, and this time we're going to put ID in there immediately. Now let's create the reducer for ID. Inside here, first thing we're going to do is import a constant called setCurrentCharacter. And we're going to bring that in. We're going to follow the same kind of format we did before. So we've got an actions file. Then we want to do an initial state for this one. And this one's just going to be 0. And then lastly, we export default, a new function where state will default to initial state, and we'll take in an action. We want to switch on the action type, and the default one will just be to return the state we were passed. Now what happens when we see setCurrentCharacter? Well, this one's pretty simple also. We want to set a new case statement, and inside the action there will be an ID, and we want to return that action ID. So a lot of this should look very familiar to the first reducer we created. We imported some stuff, we set an initial state, and then we made sure to export a function that is our reducer and handles all the actions that come in accordingly. So now that we've created our reducer and we've set up where everything's going to be stored, we need to start creating our actions. Inside that same directory, we're going to create a new file called actions.js. First things first, we know we need to export a constant called setCurrentCharacter, and it's just going to be equal to that. While we're in this file, we can go ahead and create our action creator for our setCurrentCharacter action that will be handled by the reducer we just created. So in here, we're going to export a function, and it's just going to be called setCurrentCharacter. It's going to take in an ID, and this is going to be a very simple one. All it does is it returns a new action where the type is the constant we created earlier, and it's going to pass that ID through also. So now we want to make sure that this particular action we created is kicked off anytime someone clicks on one of our characters in the character list. Well, how do we do that? Well, remember I said that mapState2Props takes in more than one parameter. It can also take in a second one that is typically called mapDispatch2Props. This works very similarly to how mapState2Props works, except it's passed dispatch instead of the state. And we want to return an object just like mapState2Props. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a function that's called setCharacter, and it takes an ID. Now the reason, for those who may not have seen this sort of syntax before, but in ES 2015 and forward, when you have an object, you can set functions on them in this syntax, and this is the same as doing something, for example, like, you could do it with an arrow function, or you could set this equal to function like that. It's the same thing, just a little bit cleaner. So since we have our setCharacter function here, it is actually going to be a curried function where we are going to actually return another function from it. Now, why would we do this? Well, the reason for this is because we want to make sure this ID stays around after our map runs. And you'll see what I'm talking about once I get to that point. We're going to return a function that, when called, will use the dispatch that is passed into mapDispatch2Props, and is going to use that to dispatch an action, in this case the setCurrentCharacter action, passing it the ID. This is going to create this action here, which will then be dispatched to our store. When our store sees it, it's going to get passed to every single reducer that we've created, and it's going to be each reducer's job to figure out what to do. Here, it's going to be passed here, all the way down to here, all the way down to here. And this one will see, oh, okay, cool, setCurrentCharacter. I want to pull the ID out of that and return it, and that will then become its piece of state. So at character ID, inside our state, we'll have the current character's ID. So now that we have our map dispatch to props function all set, we need to make sure that we're passing it down here so that our character list knows about it. Since it now knows about it, that means it's going to be passed in through props, so we can pull that out of our props object. And now we need to make sure that anytime one of our list items is clicked on, that we run this function, and that will send the ID to the store. Now you may be wondering, why am I invoking it here? Usually you don't want to invoke them because we want to wait till someone clicks on it to invoke it. And you're right. But in this case, since we're actually returning a function from a function, we call it because once this map runs, this ID will no longer be here. And we need to make sure that it stays around and that each onClick has its own particular ID that it will pass to our action. To do that, we need to make sure that we create a closure here. That's what passing a function from inside a function does. Any of the arguments passed into this function are still going to be available to this inside function. So that means when we pass the ID in here, we're returning a function. That function becomes the onClick handler up here for each of our LIs. But because of the beauty of JavaScript and closures, the ID stays around so that when we actually click on one of them, it uses the correct ID that is passed to the current character. JavaScript in all its beauty. We need to make sure we remember to bring in the action creator from our actions file, and that's going to be a reducer/character/actions. And actually, now that I remember it, an ID is not passed. This isn't the greatest API ever, so we actually need to do I+1 here, not c.id. Now that we have all this, let's make sure everything is working correctly. We'll open up iTerm and we'll restart this to make sure it sees the file. It brings this up. And we can bring up the Redux DevTools here. We see it passed set characters. And I'll even make this smaller so we can see it come through. But when we click on a particular person, we'll see that set character. We can see the action here. We can see the diff. And anytime we click on one, we can see how it's changing. If we look in the state itself, we know that that lives at character and ID. So as I go through, each time it changes in our state. Wonderful. So now that we have our character reducer set up and we have our onClick handlers set up to react to our dispatch, we need to start getting some data based on the character we clicked on. So in the next one, we will do just that.